We have the Nefer Lauma reruns incoming, and with how relevant they are to each other, I wanted to combine them both into one video to ask the big question on everyone's lips: should you get them? And here's the thing. Lauma, yes. Nefer, no. Alright, let's get into it. These two characters are the Lunar Bloom characters in the game. Their gameplay experience is taking the Bloom reaction and turning it into ammo via Verdant Dew. So then they can use it for their skill, which is pretty much like how someone like Navia took the Crystallize reaction and turned it into ammo for her skill. That's why I actually called the reaction Bloom Navia. Now, to TLDR both their kits, Nefer is the on-field DPS. In Ascendant Gleam, she converts all Bloom Seeds into Fails of Falsehood to buff her own damage, which in turn disables all non-Lunar Bloom reactions. Her skill activates a Dance Mode with Shades, which of course makes her charge attacks become the main DPS. Her burst is mainly used to stall for more Dew generation. Lauma is the off-field support. Her tap skill provides a Dendro AoE with Red Shred, 25% a crown by the way, that follows you around. Her hold skill does the same thing, but also can consume dews for a big Lunar Bloom hit. Her burst gives a team-wide Bloom Gin buff, and consuming dews with her hold skill will give you more Bloom Gin stacks. And her A1 is probably the most important part of her kit, where she can enable Bloom reactions to crit or give Lunar Bloom reactions more crit value depending on the team. This of course can stack with something like C2 Nahida. Both characters are Moonside, buffing Lunar Bloom damage with their EM. Both have charge attack running modes, but Lauma's is great whilst Nefer's is kinda ass. So with all that out of the way, I wanted to structure the video a little bit differently by asking and answering a few questions. So before we get into all of that, I want to remind you all to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because your support can of course help combat the dreaded YouTube algorithm. And if you're watching this on mobile, then there might actually be a hype button available. You can click that in order to hype the video, and that should also help combat the YouTube algorithm. First things first, is Nefer fun? I think out of the 4 or 5, if you want to count Columbina, Nod Cry on-fielders in the game so far, Nefer is the most enjoyable one to play. Now, initially, I thought her kit was clunky as hell, but as it turns out, remembering that you only have 3 charge attacks and trying to animation cancel, these two things not just help make your DPS better, but also immediately make her gameplay feel a lot smoother. I like characters that can move around a lot, such as Cloran, and Nefer to some extent does that. When we use her special charge attacks, we can animation cancel. Now, I think this is actually key to Nefer's gameplay, and we can see in the background footage, if I've edited this video correctly, that animation cancelling will give us a notable DPS increase, but more importantly, I'd argue it's way more fun to play Nefer with animation cancelling than it is to not. We are primarily cancelling with dashes. Jumps are not going to cut it. I'd recommend animation cancelling after Nefer's leg sweep animation has concluded. That seems to be the way to go. And the big reason why is because while we're doing these animation cancels, one of the quirks of Nefer is that you don't actually have to reuse your normal attack button, i.e. re-click, to start the next special charge attack. If you animation cancel with sprints, that is. So she's not actually as sweatlord tryhard as one would have initially thought. Another way we can animation cancel is by bringing in her ult. So, let's talk about her ult. It's just 2 hits of damage, but generally speaking, we're using it for a couple of reasons. The first one is to animation cancel, and the second one is to give us time to generate dews. Now, prior to Columbina, reason number 2 was really what kept Nefer's ult relevant in the grand scheme of things. Well, that and her ult animation is almost as sexy as the illustrious in the extreme, Her Royal Highness, the Queen of Sass, Yai Miko, the Wise and Beautifuls. So Nefer's DPS rotation in a non-Columbina team was usually skill 1 into 3 charge attacks, then ult, and then skill 2 into 3 charge attacks. After Columbina, we don't really need to use her ult for those purposes, but in testing that theory, I think we get a noticeable DPS loss, so maybe her ult is still relevant in that regard. By the way, if you're not animation cancelling, then your Nefer gameplay experience is going to be pretty much identical to Nefer-less, but I'd say way more boring. Now, despite Nefer being probably the most fun on-fielder from the Nod Cry cycle so far, Lowen, of course, looking like he might be a blast, for those who know. The other question is, why do I not recommend getting her? Well, simply put, it's because she's an on-fielder and a very hyper-specific one at that. She's Bloom Skirk. One of her great strengths is also, in my opinion, one of her greatest reasons to actually just skip her. She pretty much has one team. Although, to be fair, Skirk is more restrictive than Nefer. Despite that, I am probably one of the very few Nefer players to actually play alternative but interesting variants of her teams. It's the Nefer team, and that's pretty much it. If you don't have the characters, or if you're going up against content that actively counters the archetype, you're cooked. On top of that, it turns out these days that the Nefer team is quite often a quadra-mage team. I love mages, but except Ningguang, one thing they can't do much of, usually, is poise damage, i.e. to break things like Geoshields. Compare her to the most fun on-field DPS in the game, still, Clorand. Regardless of the DPS difference between these two characters or the DPS difference between Clorand's teams, the fact remains that you can actually play, and probably will play, Clorand in a variety of team archetypes. There's no such thing as the Clorand team. Her kit lends itself to a variety of options. As if that wasn't enough reason, the Nefer Lauma team usually consists of Columbina, who by the way is one of 2 new characters since Nefer and Lauma's release that I would of course added in a What's New segment for these kinds of videos. The other character being of course Yehoda, who as a side note functions as a healing option for Nefer teams so long as the Dendro auras aren't active at the time, so that during her skill usage she could actually fill up her bottle with Hydro. It's a bit finicky to use her, so let's just leave it at that. But the reason why I bring up Columbina is because if you decide to get Lauma and Columbina first, before you go ahead and get someone like Nefer, well, you kind of already have the makings of, by my estimation, the far superior variant of a DPS Columbina team. Because as it turns out, Columbina can also be played as a Lunar Bloom DPS on-fielder with a similar, albeit slower, experience to Nefer. Both these characters are charge attack based, both will rely on Columbina's ult for the Mountain Dews, and both will of course rely on Lauma's Bloom Gin stacks for a significant DPS buff. Let's look at it this way. If I only had Lauma and Columbina, would I rather go for Columbina's signature or Nefer? Well, according to the simulacrum results from my account, I can actually reach 115k DPS with DPS Columbina using Dockhand's Nilou compared to 127k with Nefer with Medic Columbina. So cost-wise, they're not too unsimilar. But I happen to have something called Key of Karshna Suit, which brings the DPS Columbina team up to 135k DPS. So for me, seems like gunning for Columbina's signature would have been a better choice over getting Nefer. And that's before you think about the myriad of team archetypes and permutations that someone like Columbina can fit in as well. All of this to say, I like Nefer. I play with her from time to time. She certainly is now one of my strongest teams because I don't have to buy, but I still probably wouldn't recommend her in the grand scheme of things. Let's continue talking about teams for both Nefer and Lauma. There's 2 team variants for Nefer that I want to talk about. The Nefer team, like I mentioned earlier, and Aggravate Nefer. These days, the Nefer team consists of Nefer, Lauma, and Columbina. Columbina's release gave us Mountain Dews, an extra layer of dew generation that, like I mentioned before, means that we don't actually have to use Nefer's ult in the middle of her DPS rotation to stall for more time to generate more dews. Although, to be fair, the first Nefer DPS period still needs this, subsequent ones won't. Mountain Dews also mean that we can use the hold skill on Lauma all the time, which is great because not only is Lauma's hold skill a rather satisfying nuke if you actually build it for DPS, but also for the additional Bloomgen stacks that will also be used by Lauma's hold skill if you use it after her ult like I do, Columbina's off-field direct Lunar Bloom attacks, and of course Nefer's shade damage. Now, you may have heard how Lauma is vital for all Nefer teams, which of course begs the question, what is actually the difference between having her and not? The best answer I can provide is by comparing 2 variants of a Nefer Baiju Columbina team, one with Lauma and one with my C2 Nahida, both on the same Serenade build and weapon.
Turn for the best. No more lag. No more lag. Can I get through? Comes first.
It's a difference of 137k with Lauma going down to 90k with Nahida, which is a huge difference. So why is that? Well, 1, there's a bit more Dendro Red Shred with Lauma on the team. 2, Lauma's hold skill nuke is not something that Nahida can get even close to since this isn't a quicken team. And number 3, and I think this is the more important thing, Lauma's quills are buffing not just Nefer's DPS, but Columbina's DPS. Mainly those quills that cause Columbina's DPS, even just being off-field, to jump by around 2.5 times, well 2.4 times. Having built her for DPS, this would actually make a huge difference in team DPS. The big question therefore is who's the best final slot for this team? It's the same question that Skirk mains have been asking for the better part of a year. Jamie has compiled a graphic suggesting it's a toss-up between Sucrose Nahida and C2 Nilou, with a smattering of other options being not as great but still decent. I personally would lean towards Nahida, especially C2 Nahida, specifically Favge C2 Nahida, as a way to have deep win on the team without needing to put it on Lauma so that you can have Columbina built for more DPS. Favge seems to be the make or break for getting more energy on the team, so that, and because I have C2 Nahida, this is my bias showing. The other team to mention is Aggravate Nefer, or rather, we're playing Nefer, but we're actually including an Electro off-fielder like the illustrious Yaimiko to provide some additional DPS. I mainly reserve this team for whenever I need Columbina somewhere else, so instead I replace her with Farina on this team. Because at the end of the day, because Nefer tends to do her DPS via special charge attacks and not normal attacks, someone like Yelan ends up being out of the question. At least in this team, Farina can buff herself and Miko's DPS. I'll mention this again in the Constellations section, but having C1 Lauma seems to be enough healing for Farina teams, despite it of course being single target. The team just needs to be able to trigger Lunar Bloom reactions, and then you just cycle through the team to get them healed. If you don't have Lauma C1, then you'd have to rely on someone like Ino on the team instead of someone like Farina, which of course would be a significant DPS loss. One character I want to strongly push back against is putting Nefer in the Nefer teams. Strongly only because of how weirdly popular she seems to be in Nefer teams. Placing her in this team seems absurd for a multitude of reasons. 1. It's Ascendant Gleam, but everyone's moon sign, so nobody can actually give the Ascendant Gleam lunar damage buff. 2. This is a team with overwhelming Dendro app that prevents any underlying Hydra auras from existing unless the target happens to have a permanent Hydra aura. Nefer just simply cannot trigger any lunar charge reactions. This means that Nefer's A1 doesn't work. This also means that Nefer's DPS will drop off a cliff. And 3, if it wasn't bad enough, this is a Nefer team, which means there's no Bloom Seeds, which means that Nefer can't even pretend to do any DPS by being a Hyper Bloom trigger. The only things that Nefer is providing in this team are a shield and an EM buff based on her attack for Nefer. It's a severe waste of her kit to use her in Nefer teams. Also, if you introduce Pyro in the team, you actually only end up with like Burn Vape, and that won't result in any Lunar Bloom reactions, so that means no dues. That's why there's no such thing as Burgeon Nefer, or I guess Vape Nefer. For Lauma, there's a bunch of teams that aren't just Nefer that you can enjoy, but my favorites are Nilou teams, with the biggest blooms in the history of Western civilization. It's very fun in AoE content to just watch things blow up around you. I really enjoy this a lot. Alternatively, there's DPS Columbina in that Nilou team. And finally, I want to mention as well Quick Bloom Kategari. Again, if you don't have Lauma's C1, then running Ino instead of Farina is probably the play, but it is going to be significantly worse. Or I guess Burst Ayato could be an option. Whew, that was a lot, and we're still not done. Let me know in the comments what your favorite Nefer and Nefer-less Lauma teams are. Building Nefer and Lauma is actually quite straightforward. For weapons, I'd say Nefer has 4 weapons worth thinking about, and Lauma has 2. Nefer Sig is her best in slot and happens to be the new Lisa overall best in slot. If you somehow have a spare Columbina Sig, however, you can use that on Nefer and just move on with your life. You do get a lot of crit damage for Lunar hits, to the point where I prefer using an HP hat on Columbina, so you're probably going to want to consider using an EM hat on Nefer with this weapon. I'm not entirely sure if the same happens with Nefer's Sig though. Dawning Frost is a gacha only 4-star weapon that is basically Witsith if Witsith didn't have the RNG to be amazing a few times and absolute trash most other times. It's only 240 EM that you're getting instead of Witsith's bonkers 480 EM, but in the grand scheme of things, that's not a huge difference, I think. Black Marrow Lantern is a craftable for when all else isn't available. I actually use this, and even with Black Marrow, the Nefer team seems to be pretty much my strongest team. I've left it at level 80 because a whopping 20 EM isn't going to be worth going to level 90. But if you have Linnea, it is now hilariously easy to mine the rocks since Lumi is a rock vacuum. Meanwhile, for Lauma, I first want to mention Aetherlight Spindle Loot, because if you did that event, this is pretty much the weapon you're going to be using on her. It's almost an ER stand's worth of substat and 200 EM, which makes it very good for teams where using Lauma's ult is recommended, like the Nefer team. And I mentioned that because Lauma's Sig is still a jump in power, but like what a lot of TCers seem to believe, I'm not entirely convinced that it's all that great. You do get 125 more EM than Spindle Loot, and your bloom reactions get buffs that are essentially more EM applied to them. So if you do get her Sig and then run an ER Sand, I suppose you would be positive for both EM buffs and energy to her ult. Is it worth it though? Probably not. If all else fails, I'd go for sack frags, especially if you have C1 Lauma, because then you can start a rotation with some healing before going back to Lauma to refresh your skill duration again. And even if that's not available for some reason, then Black Marrow Lantern would be the play. Refines end up being really optional, it just depends on whether you want more nuke damage. For artifacts, Nefer should be using the Night Sky set. That's it. It's designed for her and other on-fielders in Lunar teams. If you don't have that sorted out yet, then 2-piece EM would be the placeholder. Or hell, might I shall say if you're playing with Farina. I've kept Lauma on Serenade. I know a lot of folks suggest 2-piece EM with someone else like Columbina on Serenade. I don't like that because I have Columbina built for DPS. You can use Deep Wood on Lauma, but it seems to result in very similar DPS, and the additional Red Shred is likely to only have half as much value because Lauma already has Red Shred. Nefer should be running EM crit, whilst Lauma should be running triple EM, but I actually run a crit pat on Lauma because I'm based like that and I like big nukes and I cannot lie. If you're desperate, an ER Sand is fine on Lauma. Do keep in mind how much crit rate you have on your build, of course, for Nefer, since you do have the Night Sky 4-piece buff. We're nearly done, folks, because finally we have the Constellations, and as per usual, you don't need any of Nefer's Constellations. You don't exactly need any of Lauma's Constellations either, but I did go out of my way to get her C1, and I honestly like actually having that around. Lauma C1 is healing, and it's relatively fast single-target healing. Like I mentioned, it seems to be fast enough to handle Farina teams. Now, Lauma C1 isn't a DPS buff in the most direct sense. Instead, it enables bringing more DPS options, such as Nahida instead of Baiju, which, for the record, in my experience, that's another 40k DPS, with 137k DPS with Baiju jumping up to 170-something k DPS with Nahida. That being said, I would never use a healing hat on Lauma unless things are at the utmost desperate need. On top of that, you can gallop for much longer, which basically means you can gallop much further as well, so I do kind of really like having Lauma C1 around. Lauma C2 is an increase to her Bloom Gin stack scaling and some Lunar Bloom damage buffs. Assuming I haven't made a hilarious misreading somewhere, it's actually double strength Bloom Gin stacks at crown level, which might make more of an emphasis to have more ER so you can get her ult back every rotation. Her C3 is ult level, so C5 is skill levels. Both are great because ult levels mean stronger Bloom Gin stacks. Her skill levels, of course, means more Red Shred. C4 gives Lauma some energy when her skill hits enemies every 5 seconds, which I guess would be pretty great if you already have her C2, which of course puts more emphasis on using her ult. And C6 adds both another way to generate Bloom Gin stacks and can turn her normal attacks into direct Lunar Bloom damage. Thus, we have on-field DPS Lauma. This also includes a separate 25% increase to Lunar Bloom damage, which I'm not entirely sure existed before Columbina, but I feel like was a thing with Columbina's release, since her constellations are chock-a-block full of these elevation memes. But let me know in the comments if you remember this Lunar Bloom elevation thing to have existed with Lauma prior to Columbina's release. Meanwhile, on Nefer, her C1 is a relatively decent talent value buff, I guess. Her C2 is a wall of text that apparently just means that her veils last longer, you can hold more of them, your skill gets a 40% base damage buff, and you get another 100 EM after maxing out your veil stacks. Her C3 is skill levels, her C5 is ult levels. As far as I can tell, this should make her C5 kinda worthless. And C4 is faster dew generation and some more Red Shred. I'm not entirely sure if this is meaningful at all. And C6 is a lot of things to make Nefer do more damage, and the aforementioned Lunar Bloom elevation buff meme that I don't remember if it existed prior to Columbina. It does, however, convert Nefer's own second hit of her charge attack, not her shades, into direct Lunar Bloom damage, which actually would suggest not using dash cancels anymore, or at the very least, dash canceling a little bit later than usual. I guess. I don't know. Yeah, I think I'd rather go for more characters and have more team options to mess around with than to vertically invest in either of them past C1 Lauma. But that's just, of course, one man's opinion on all of this. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. Oh, one more thing I want to point out is that despite having Lauma and playing with her a lot more in my Lunar Bloom and hell, even the Hyper Bloom and Quick Bloom teams, I haven't exactly permabenched Nahida despite what the TCers would have had you all think. I still play with her in my favorite Aggravate teams. She still has a spot as the best final spot, I think, in the Nefer team. There's also the Nilou teams, and that includes DPS Columbina that I would feature Nahida in. Because I have Lauma C1, then I can also handle the healing from Lauma. So I would argue that Nahida's value isn't even remotely as cooked as some folks would have you believe. But that's just what I think. Alright, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more Genshin Impact action. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Friendship.